All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to another webinar in our CWSRF Funding Process Virtual Workshop Series. Today's session will address managing a grant after you've been awarded. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for your personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or if you need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or your utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our presenters for today. We have Dawn Nall and Heather Himmelberger. They are both joining us from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. Welcome to you both. I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Dawn.
I had it all set up and ready to go and then realized I was still on mute and had to figure that all out. So I apologize for all of that there, but hopefully all is working now. So I appreciate the introduction, and Heather and I are here today to talk to you about the last step of our CWSRF series. We've had webinars every month since the beginning of January. And so hopefully you've been able to attend more than just this one, but if you haven't, welcome, and know that you can view all of the previous webinars, and I've got a slide coming up that has them on our website. First, we just wanted to spend a second talking about our program team. Heather and I are both from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and we are based out of the University of New Mexico. And Kristen is from Syracuse University EFC. You can see our team here. We are mostly Environmental Finance Center network based, but we do have a couple of partners on this project that are not EFCs, including Moonshot Missions and Mississippi State's Water Resource Research Institute. So we have a lot of expertise, university backed. We can help with a wide variety of technical assistance and training opportunities for you guys. So the SRF series is just a small part of what we're offering through this program. And as I mentioned, this is a series that we have been doing since January, and here's the series and the dates they were hosted. And we did them on the third Thursday, except for this month because we're approaching those holidays so quickly. We moved it to Tuesday. So this is the only one that is occurring on a Tuesday, and all of the rest have happened regularly. And we seem to have had really good participation and feedback that that's a positive. And as we're planning for next year, if that's something that you guys would like to continue to see more of, we'd love to hear feedback about what works well for you, and you know, if this has been helpful to have this on a consistent day of the month, things like that, so that we can continue to do what works well for you. And before we dig into the content today, we do have a small disclaimer, every state has an SRF program, and every state is a little bit different. So we cannot go into the specifics for your state since this is a national webinar and we've got people from all around the country. So we're going to talk about activities that are common for most infrastructure projects, but we want you to know that we work with the states and we do have information on our website that can get you in contact with your state's SRF folks, and we can help you address individual questions if you have those. But today is a broader, bigger picture because this is a national webinar. All right, so what are we going to be talking about today? We are going to discuss different portions of what you need to do after you know that you are going to apply for SRF funding and are likely to be awarded. So we're going to talk a bit about planning and the planning phase and how important that is, and then working with professionals, and then I'll turn it over to Heather and she's going to cover milestones and a little bit on financing. So we're going to just dig right into project planning and why planning is so important to the success of your project. So we're starting today's discussion with planning because it really is a very important first step in understanding your goals for your project. So if you take a look at this graph, it's showing you how your ability to influence your project changes through the various project phases, along with how the cost of those changes change over the project phases. So that you have an influence line and an expenditures line through the different phases of your project. And of course, you have the greatest ability to make any changes to your project in that very earliest phase, which is the planning phase. And you can do those changes at the lowest cost during the planning phase. So during this time, you really need to think about your goals for the project and make sure you're meeting that goal by doing this particular project, which we'll spend some more time talking about. But this is the influence line, and then this is your cost or expenditures line, and you can see that they change very quickly as you move through the phases of the project. So let's take a look at an example of how this these two concepts change as you move through the phases. So here you have your planning phase. Your planner indicates that the location of a lift station should be next to a busy street downtown, that's the best place because of the contours of the land, and that's where the pipes start to get deep and so on and so forth. So that's where the lift station is indicated that it should be during the planning phase. And then you get to the design phase and your engineer designs the project with that lift station location just as it was, planned. And then you get to the construction phase and your contractor builds that lift station in that exact location. And then you get to that operations phase and your operator realizes that that location has two pretty significant problems. The location is really inaccessible during high traffic volumes in downtown during the middle of the day, when the operator is going to be working during his regular business hours or her regular business hours. And so not being able to access that lift station during business hours is challenging. It means you can't do any kind of repair or maintenance during those times. And then also, the nearby businesses are really at a risk if that lift station were to overflow. So it's right there in downtown, lots of businesses. We can't get to it during business hours. And so if we had a backup or any kind of clog or for any reason there was an overflow, it's going to impact several businesses. So here you are with this lift station constructed and your operators say, oh, this is just the worst possible location for this lift station. So if we want to change the location of that lift station, what would that look like? Well, if we were in that planning phase, the cost to change the location of the lift station would be the lowest that it would ever be. Because at this point, you haven't invested much in the project financially. You've invested time, you've invested thought, you've invested energy, but you haven't invested infrastructure costs. And then if we move into that design phase, the engineer is going to have to make changes to understanding the flows and understanding what that changes, how much pipe that's going to change if we relocate this pump station, what the depth of the pump station now has to be, if we have to change the size of the pump, all of those different things. And then obviously also the cost to change the drawings, the design, those things. And then if you've constructed the lift station and you want to move it, those costs really start to rise. It's built, it's in place. So all of that money that you spent to get it in the ground is now you're throwing it out the door. And then if you get to the operation phase where you've waited a few months, it's been operational, the project's complete, and you decide that it's just not accomplishing what you needed it to do, the cost will be probably prohibitive. So you're going to have to adjust and make a bad thing work, a brand new bad thing work, because the costs are so high at that point that they're likely prohibitive to relocate that asset. So if you put the time and the effort into the planning, you really will have the best project possible. And that's the concept that we want you to remember and think about as we continue through today, is that your planning stage is your best opportunity to have a good impact on your project. And part of that planning, in order to plan well, you have to understand what your goals for the project are. What are you starting with? Is there an existing problem or a need for growth? And what are the overall needs that have to be met by this project? Then you need to think about what this new infrastructure will need for ongoing success. What types of operation, maintenance, repairs, and eventually replacement will be needed. And one way to help you with that type of planning is asset management. And asset management involves 5 core components. And as you can see here, working your way through these 5 core components isn't about starting at point A and ending at point B. Asset management really is an ongoing management tool. And the 5 core components that are a part of asset management are shown here: current state of the assets, criticality, life cycle costing, long-term funding, and level of service. And I started at current state of the assets, but we tend to start our discussion with level of service when we're talking about asset management. But it doesn't mean that that's where you have to start, and it's definitely not where you end. So asset management is this ongoing management tool process that helps you with decision making. As you go through planning, sometimes just getting started seems overwhelming. How can you possibly know all of that information? Well, it's likely that you won't. So you're going to need to think through questions like the ones that we've listed here. So you need to clearly define your project and what the need for that project is. And sometimes when we're in this planning phase, we really like to grow that list from the things that we need into the things that would be nice or that would make the job easier. And that really isn't necessarily a bad thing, because you do want the project to meet the needs of your, of more than just your customers, but you want to be very clear of what the need for your customers is and for your operations is, and then what those nice things are, so that you can focus on accomplishing your goal of meeting a need. And you really want to think about the timing of the project. If there is a project in 2 years that's going to also be tearing up all of the pavement on Main Street, should we do this project now? Or should we focus on doing it then, when we're going to be replacing the pavement anyway? Have you thought about making changes to your current operations that could maybe avoid new construction altogether? So are there things that you could change with what you have right now that would make it to where you didn't need this project at all? So questions to kind of consider. And you're going to need a lot of information during the planning phase. And some of the types of information you'll need to collect or develop are listed here on your screen. You always want to use the information that you already have. Oftentimes that information's been sitting on a shelf collecting dust for a lot of years, but now it could be very useful. Things like as-built or thinking about what's worked in the past and what hasn't worked in the past. Do we have good operations for this process? Do we have good SOPs? So identify your goals for the project by understanding things like what level of service you need to provide and how it impacts your customers. Thinking about costs, not just from a financial perspective, but from a triple bottom line perspective, where you also consider, any costs, not just the financial, but costs to the physical environment, and then any costs to the social environment, like your community, businesses, and so on. So when you're answering these questions about project timing and budget, if the answer is that it's not the right time or it's not the right project, you should really stop here and reevaluate, because this is the best time to do it when it's at the lowest possible cost. However, if the answer is that it is the right project and it is the right time, then it's time to move into the design phase. So now you'll be working with other professionals, such as your engineer. So we're going to take a look at a couple of things to keep in mind during the design phase. There are really two main factors that we're going to focus on today: alternatives and operations. So we're going to start by talking about project alternatives. How do you evaluate them? What do you want to see in those alternatives? So when you're evaluating the possible solutions, different types of projects that can get you to the same endpoint, you want to make sure you're looking at how many alternatives are presented, and if you think all of the viable alternatives have been considered. You'll also want to make sure that the alternatives have been given equal consideration, that we haven't made the decision before actually evaluating the options. Sometimes we kind of go in with a little bias or a preconceived notion of what would be best before we evaluate the options. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure we give equal consideration to every alternative. We want to think about who should be involved in reviewing those alternatives, who will be interacting with the new project during the construction phase and the operations phase, who will be called in to repair it. So you want to make sure you're communicating these things with your engineer before they submit the alternatives analysis. You'll also want to be certain that you have a clear understanding of the full cost for each operation, or each option, sorry. So this should include operations and maintenance costs. And when you're looking at requesting the cost in the alternatives analysis, if you request a life cycle cost as opposed to a purchase cost, it can really change what you look at as an affordable option, because maintenance costs can be very high for some of these projects that are supposed to last for 20, 30, 40 or more years. So if your project includes assets that will use energy, such as pumps, motors, or blowers, or you name it, anything that uses energy, you'll want to make sure that you're looking at the operations cost for those assets. Energy efficient options may pay for themselves many times over through their useful life. Even if it costs a little bit more upfront in capital, if it's more efficient to operate that day in and day out at a lower cost, likely over its lifespan, it will pay for itself to have those higher costs up front. And then you want to take a look at what types of technologies are being presented. Sometimes newer technologies provide great opportunities, but sometimes going with something familiar can be better. So you want to think about, if new technologies are being presented, that you have a chance to speak to others that have maybe experienced that new technology, have implemented it at their plants, or have done a case study or a pilot project to make sure that you get the answers that you need about how that new technology would be implemented and how it works for your system. So here's just a couple of examples of when the alternatives evaluation helped systems identify some issues that really could have been very costly if the systems had moved forward with the selected alternative. So the first one here is that a wastewater system's new plant required a level 4 operator, but the operator was a level 2. So had we, looked at the recommended, had we not looked at the recommended alternative closely, and looked at the details, it seemed like the best plant, the best design, the best option. But then when you look at the requirements and you say, oh, we're gonna have to have a level 4 operator. Well, that's not always the easiest thing to do, is just go out and hire a level 4 operator. It's not in your budget. The salary change is not in your budget. The expertise may not be in your area. And having your operator train up to a level 4 is altogether possible, but it does take time. So is there time between now and when the system is operational to have your operator go from a level 2 to a level 4? And in this case, that just wasn't the ideal situation. And so really reevaluating the infrastructure and the alternatives, knowing that your operator has to be classified. And I know not all states use levels, some use numbers, some use letters, some use classifications. But the point here is that they had to go to a higher level to be able to operate that new plant. And it could have caused the plant to not be operational at all, or be in violation with state laws. And then the second example here is, during the funding system review process, it was really clear that the alternatives analysis was not thorough, and that less expensive, better alternatives were not considered. So the funding agency ended up rejecting the PER and required it to be updated. And ultimately, the system ended up with a different solution after new alternatives were presented that was at a lower cost, just a better alternative. So the system, if the system hadn't done a good review and the funders hadn't done a good review, they could have ended up with a much more expensive option, that could have been harder to run and operate and maintain. And so doing that review process, they found that, we want to ask for more alternatives and better options. And that's where they ended up landing, was with one of the new alternatives. So while the planning phase is the lowest cost phase for making changes, the design phase still allows you to make changes at a relatively low cost. If you don't bother to get involved with that alternatives evaluation, it could be a really costly mistake, because now you're moving to that next box where the expenditure line starts to creep up very, very quickly. So the second item we want to talk to you about is involving your operations personnel throughout the planning and design phases. So think about a past project. Who interacted with the engineers on that project? Who was involved in the design discussions during that project? And how far into that design process was it before you got involved? Do you feel like your engineers listen to your requests and your ideas? Do they explain the design so that you fully understand what they are proposing? If not, you really need to let them know that you would like to have it presented differently. Your team knows your system better than anybody else. So sharing your knowledge is really important to the success of your project. Your engineer understands design principles really well, but that doesn't always equate to them understanding your operations. So make sure that you're communicating with them about how things work for you. Design and operations are inextricably intertwined. The best design won't achieve its intended purpose without good operations. And the best operations certainly can't fix a poor design. You want intentional design that takes operations and maintenance requirements into account. When we look at this graph again, the last phase is the operations phase. If your operations folks aren't involved in the earlier phases and they are quote unquote handed a plant, which we hear from operators a lot. Yeah, this just got handed to us. The likelihood that they want change is pretty high, but the likelihood that you can afford those changes is pretty low. So when you're in the design phase, you want to think about the activities that it will take to operate each part of the design. And you also want to think about what types of maintenance will be needed. What spare parts are you going to need? Can you purchase them locally, or will there be a lead time and delivery time? Will the changes that are proposed affect the level of operator that you need? Will the new design require more staff than you currently have? Will any specialized training be needed to operate or maintain the equipment? So all of these things, you need to have your operations folks involved in being able to answer those questions and provide you with good knowledge from their experiences. Otherwise, like I said, you're going to get to that last box and you're going to have unhappy operations folks. And then the last little bit that I want to talk to you about today is just a few other things to keep in mind when you're constructing your project. So we have a list here of things that typically can get overlooked, and we want to make sure that they're on your radar. So who from your team should be involved in each stage of the construction inspection? I've been on jobs before where we didn't have anyone from the wastewater system present when we were doing construction inspection. And I felt like it was such a missed opportunity, because I don't know what you guys know about operating your system. And so me doing the inspection is one thing, but having someone from your team be involved is so important. So can you make the time? Who should that person be? Do they need to be there all day, every day, or once a day, or once a week? Talking to your engineer and your contractor about those kinds of things is important. And then, will there be any need for equipment to be tested before you actually take ownership of it? So before it gets turned on for the first time, do you want it to be tested before it's yours, before you own it? Sometimes there is a real need to make sure it's tested and operational before you take ownership. And then who's going to be responsible for your as-built and your map review? And what format would you like them in? Do you want them on paper and on floppy disk, or on CD, or thumb drive, or SharePoint, or how do you want those? And you guys get to define that as long as you're communicating with your engineer and you put that in your specifications. That you want your as-builts to be on paper and also in a GIS map or a Google map or whatever works best for you. What other documentation do you need? Do you need O&M manuals? Yes. Do you need SOPs? Yes. Do you have copies of your warranties? So on and so forth. So what other documentation should the engineer and contractor be providing to you at the conclusion of the project? And finally, get a list. Who do we contact for post-construction questions and supply questions, so that you're not scrambling to figure out who the supplier was for this part, or who the manufacturer was, or how do we get a hold of that contractor? Get a list before they're offsite. So we're going to take a pause for a poll question. So I think if we can go ahead and run the poll question, that would be fantastic. And I probably can't see it if it is running. So the question is, at your utility, are operators given a chance to provide input into the planning and design of the new facilities? And you have several options there. Yes, they have extensive involvement. Yes, they have some limited involvement. No, but we think we should do this. No, we don't think it's necessary, or not sure, or it doesn't apply to you. You're not a utility.
All right, give everyone just a couple more seconds. Go ahead and get your answers in. Closing the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Can you see the poll answers, Dawn? If not, I can share it.
I cannot.
Okay, so it looks like 19% said yes, they have extensive involvement in planning and design. 20% had limited involvement. 6% said no, but think we should do it. And then 54% were not sure or not applicable.
Okay, great, great. So I hope that we have changed your mind a bit today. If you are not in the answering at the first level that they have extensive involvement, that there is a really good reason to have them involved, and it goes back to that graph. You know, and when you have the most opportunity to make any kind of impact on changes to your project at the lowest cost. So at this point, I am going to turn things over to Heather and let her talk to you a bit more about some of the things you have to do after you have CWSRF dollars in hand.
Okay, and I just want to check that you can hear me and that you're seeing the proper slide.
Yes. Yes, I can see the slide and you sound great.
Thank you. Okay, now we'll move on to looking at or talking about setting project milestones. So once you're ready to do a project, it's a really good idea to set some project milestones. And milestones are sort of these major and minor tasks along the way to completing your project. So it gives you a chance to think about, you know, what do you have to do to complete this project that you're starting? So the first milestones we want to look at are these major boundaries. So we're basically going to initiate the project. So that's the very beginning. And then we want to complete the project. That's the very end. So these give us sort of those big picture boundaries along the way. And then we want to think about what are the activities, outputs, outcomes associated with these boundary conditions. So what goes along with getting your project done? And so we need to take one step back and think a little bit about what is an output and an outcome. And these may not be terms that you're super familiar with yet, but hopefully if you're considering a project in the future or you're doing one now, it's something to think about. And it's really getting into what you want to have happen. So an output is what you can think of as kind of bean counting. You may have heard the term bean counting, and that's where we want to count like how many of something happened. That's what an output is. So what happened? What are the numeric results that happened? So I did 10 of these, 5 of those, 4 of those. I put in 2 miles of sewer. I put in 3 pump stations, that sort of thing. So it's a very numeric kind of thing. It doesn't involve a consideration of quality. It involves a consideration of quantity. So an output has to do with numbers. So some examples, the number of people served by a wastewater system. So you put in a new system, or you're adding to the system that you have, and you're adding a certain number of people that are going to be served. Or the number of gallons of water or wastewater that you're treating. The number of miles of pipe that you put in the ground, or like I mentioned before, the number of pump stations you added, or the number of valves, anything. So it's really about numbers of things that are going to happen. Outcomes are a bit different. Outcomes get into the level of performance, the achievements, the quality that occurred because of what you did. So it's sort of an assessment of the success of the project. So this is sort of like looking at the project in a slightly different way. It's not about the numbers, it's about what actually happened. How did you improve the lives of the people in your community or the environment, or how did you make something better? So it could be something like an increase in the percent of people served by the wastewater system, or improvement of water quality, such as through reduction of particular contaminant in the discharge of wastewater. So you're trying to do something that is helping the environment. It's more to do with quality. So it's not the numbers, it's the quality. So both of them are needed. So it's not one is better than the other, it's one is different than the other, and we need both of them to assess the effectiveness of the project. Outputs tend to be easier and faster to measure and to achieve because Like if we're putting in so many miles of pipe, we can tell right away that we have done that. If we're looking at an environmental benefit, it may take a bit longer to achieve that environmental benefit. But the outcomes may better define the success of your project. So something to think about when you're building a project is you want to build it to achieve outcomes and outputs. You want it to do something, and you should be able to describe those outcomes you are trying to achieve with the project. And if you can't, you might ask yourself, why am I doing this project? Because it should be very easy for you to say, we're doing this because, you know, we may need a new pump station because we're having a lot of overflows at the pump station, or fills up too much with stormwater or something else, and when it's heavy flow it can't produce enough, or the pumps are failing, or who knows. But you're doing the project for a reason, and this is giving you a chance to articulate those reasons. So then, so the first thing, of course, is describing these outcomes you're trying to achieve, and then the second one is we want to turn those outcomes into something that can be measured. So we don't want to just say, oh, I want things to be better. I want them to be better in a certain way. So I want to maybe have a % increase in the customer served, or a % decrease in the number of sewer backups. So I want to have something that I can tell if I really met that outcome or not. So for example, if our community doesn't have all the people in the community served now, and we want to add wastewater collection pipe so that we can serve more people, you know, did that actually happen? We could measure, okay, we now have 20% more people connected to the system than before. We want to confirm that the outcomes are linked to the outputs and activities. So basically, if I would say I want, you know, a reduction of nutrients going into the receiving water, but the only thing that I was doing was adding sewer, that is highly unlikely to have the outcome that I want. So I need to make sure that what I'm doing matches the outcome. So if I'm adding sewer, the outcome should match that. If I'm adding treatment, the outcome should match that. So basically making sure we're not picking outcomes that have nothing to do with the activities that we're doing. And then we want to implement the measurement of outcomes and track over time. So are we getting closer to achieving these outcomes? Are we doing the things that we need to do in order to achieve that outcome? And then at the end, hopefully we can demonstrate our success to regulatory agencies, elected leaders, customers, and others, funders, based on our data. So if we do this whole project, which, you know, it could take a couple of years for sure, maybe it even takes another year or two after that to be able to measure it. But at some point in the future, we want to be able to say, hey, look, you spent $3 million on this project and we achieved this outcome out of that project. And people would love to know that their money was actually doing what it's supposed to. So then once we, you know, have defined what our expected outputs and outcomes are, we can put those towards the end, you know, our boundary condition, like this is what we want to have happen when the project is completed. And then we can start to say, well, what activities do we need to do to achieve these outputs and outcomes? Like, what is it that I'm going to have to do? And it's probably very construction related, but it can also be other things. It can be operational related. It can be hiring operators. It can be training operators. It can be a variety of things. So this is not, strictly speaking, just each step of construction. This is any of the steps along the way that you need to do between project initiation and project completion. So we want to make sure we include all of our major activities. So these are really important things that maybe take a lot of time, will really have a big impact on the project. And we want to put those in. And then we want to add any minor activities. So things that we have to do in between these major activities, define those minor activities that will help us get there. And again, like I said, it can be a whole lot of different things. It can be getting training. It can be visiting another site that has the same facilities as you, or as a, you know, or proposed for your system. It can be getting certified at a higher level if you need to do that. I mean, whatever it is, and it also will include construction milestones, like, you know, we've finished the pump station on Main Street or something like that. But it's a mixed bag of different kinds of things you need to do on the way between initiation and completion. And once the major milestone activities are included on the graph, we want to add a schedule, like when do we think these will happen? And again, it's easiest to start with when do you expect to start the project and when do you expect the project to be finished? And it can be multiple years, like this example is 3 years. It can be that kind of thing. And then we can work with our engineer and funders to fill in the remaining dates. So we can, anything that we know the dates for, we can put in there. Otherwise, we talk to our engineers and funders and find out like what the dates of various activities will be. And then we want to put in the total cost. How much is this going to cost us to complete the project? So let's say this example, $2.5 million to complete this project. And then we want to spread that money out. So how will that fit along our major and minor activities? So how are we going to spend that $2.5 million? And there could be some activities that don't have much cost. If we're talking about hiring somebody, maybe that activity has a very low cost or no cost because you're not using project funds. But for this example, we just wanted to spread out the costs along these major and minor activities to show you how this works. And then you can take that graph that I just showed and put it into a table. It might be a little easier to kind of understand in this format. And we put our project initiation and all of our activities. And in your case, you would write what the specific activity is. It wouldn't say minor activity 1. It would say, hiring a construction contractor or whatever that activity was. And then you would say when your expected completion date was and your anticipated cost. And then you can do the cumulative cost to see how you're going to spend money over time. Once you do that, you can look at your expenditures and say, how do they spread out over time? Do you have any really long periods with no expenditures? Are costs higher up front, in the middle, or at the end? And one of the things you want to do when you're looking at the costs is we typically want to see a ramp up at the beginning where we're not necessarily starting with a huge amount of expenditure at the very, very beginning, but we're kind of ramping up, getting everybody on board, getting things started. And then we're going to have a higher level in the middle, and then we start ramping down to a lower level at the end. So we're kind of wanting to see a nice smooth path of expenditures. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, depending on the projects that you're doing, but that's a typical thing where we kind of start a little bit smaller, get things built up, we ramp up, and then as the project is ending, we want to slow down. We don't want to have a whole bunch of money to spend in the last couple months of a project because that's probably going to create some issues for us. Maybe we haven't been paying all along and that sort of thing if we have a whole bunch of money, kind of coming at the end. And if there are long periods with no expenditures, we may want to consider adding some tasks to spread them out. So like in this example, there's one activity that occurs in January 2026 and then another one that occurs in May 2026. Well, we may decide that we don't want to wait 5 months, we want to put something in there. That would be fine. You could put another activity in there and spread the money out a little bit more. So then during the project, we want to check the actual activities and schedules against the planned ones. So we initiated the project, we guessed at what the dates would be, and those are in the yellow highlight there. And then the green is what actually happens. So we're going to look for places where the actuals don't match the anticipated. And we noticed that we didn't actually start the project when we were supposed to. We were supposed to start in May, but we started in July. So that's of course going to have an impact all the way down. But you can see we actually made up some of that towards the end. It wasn't as far off schedule maybe at the end as at the beginning. So, you can potentially make up some time and that sort of thing. And we want to look at that, like what caused the project to go off schedule? Is there any way to get the project back on schedule? Will the slip in the project schedule cause a change in cost? And if so, how? So if we're moving into future years, or, is there anything in the contract that says if it doesn't get by a certain date, we have to pay money? Anything that could change costs in some negative way, we want to know, how that's going to occur and what the impacts are going to be. And then we also want to know if we're going to slip a lot, will that slippage in the schedule cause a problem with regulatory compliance? So for example, if you had to comply by August of 2027 and you weren't actually going to be done by by then, by July, you're going to be done by September, you need to have a conversation with your regulatory agency and explain the delay and see what can be done. So you want to really think about those things. And as the project is delayed, can you do anything to get it back on schedule? Similarly with costs, we want to compare actual costs against anticipated costs. So were they higher or lower, the same, you know, how did that work? And if it is over budget, like for example, in this example, we're $250,000 over what we thought it was going to be, where is that money going to come from? Are we, you know, do we have that money ourselves? Will the funding agency give us the extra money to cover those costs? You know, what would they want to know about why the cost overruns occurred in order to give us that money? Is there any way we could get it back on track to save money in some other place? That sort of thing. On the other hand, this is not a common occurrence at all, but if expenses are less than anticipated, you know, in some way things didn't cost as much as you thought they would, you know, what can be done with the extra funds? So do they have to go back to the funding agency, or is there something else you could do with it? Could you expand the project? Could you add something that maybe got left out? And that's really totally dependent on the funding agency, what kind of funding it is, what it's meant for, and how they handle that sort of thing. So we couldn't say what you can do with the money up front. It, again, really depends on where it came from. And that's a conversation you can have with your funder. Again, not a very common thing, but we did want to at least bring it up. And then as the project's being completed, consider whether the anticipated outputs and outcomes are actually being achieved. You know, is the project able to meet the desired outputs and outcomes? And if no, which ones won't be achieved and what will be done about it? So if you're not going to achieve these outputs and outcomes that you anticipated, you know, what are you going to do? Like, is there anything else that could be done? Are you going to have to do another project later? Or, you know, what will happen? If yes, you did achieve your outputs and outcomes, measure that and share it with everybody. Make sure that everybody knows that you did achieve the outputs and outcomes that you were after. And then consider problems with the budget or schedule. We talked about those. If we're spending more money than we thought we should, or if the schedule was off, you know, how did that impact the ability to meet your outputs and outcomes? So we have a poll question here. Do you typically measure outputs and outcomes? So I will let that get started. And I think it is open, is that correct?
Yes. Yes, the poll is now open.
So we have choices. Do you typically measure outputs and outcomes? No, we never have. No, but we're thinking about it. We have recently begun measuring outputs and outcomes. We have measured outputs and outcomes for several projects and does not apply to me. Just as a reminder too, if you want to ask for CEUs from your state, oftentimes filling out the poll questions is a requirement. So if that's something that you will be asking your state for, you know, please fill out the poll.
All right, it looks like most people have their answers in, but I'll go ahead and give everyone a couple more seconds. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
All right.
So,
can you see that, Heather?
yes.
Okay.
So I say, it looks like no, we never have is 4%. No, but we're thinking about 11%. That's good to hear. We've recently begun measuring outputs, 7%. Yay, more power to you. And we have measured outputs and outcomes for several projects, 25%. Again, gold star to those who have been doing it. And then we have about half of us that doesn't apply. But hopefully you can start doing this in the future if you haven't done it in the past. Okay, so moving on to our last topic, we're just going to spend a few minutes talking about finance. And we're going to talk about accounting, bookkeeping, and reporting. So accounting is basically this broad responsibility over developing and maintaining your financial systems, under which you do bookkeeping and reporting. So bookkeeping is this inputs part and reporting is the outputs part. So in So in overall accounting, we're concerned with timely and accurate recording of transactions, providing useful management information, and properly reporting for all people's needs, including funders. So essentially what accounting is you're trying to keep all this financial information so that anybody who needs it can access it, and that it is accurate, timely, and properly accounts for all the money you have. And if you are getting grants, it's super important, or grants, loans, you know, any money from state and federal agencies, super important to make sure that you have records of how you spent this money, what it's been used on, and that sort of thing. In bookkeeping, we're trying to keep track of all our income and expenses. We're trying to make sure that more money is coming in than going out, so revenue is greater than expenses. And then we're trying to collect the necessary financial information about our businesses, or about our organization's business, in this case, wastewater or water, to file all of our required reports. So this is, the bookkeeping part is kind of the effort of making sure we're tracking all of the costs and all that information that comes in. And this is actually the transaction entering, recording of data, so writing checks, processing payroll, making deposits, recording disbursements, recording receipts, all of that stuff happens under bookkeeping. Under reporting, this is where we do the output part. So we've got all this information and we want to report it to somebody. So we might want to report it internally within our organization to our management or elected leaders, somebody else within the organization who needs it. And then external reporting can be done by individuals outside the organization. So we can also do reporting to our funders, our regulatory bodies, anybody like that who might need information from us. So the financial process involves identifying and recording all of our transactions, reconciling and analyzing all of our accounts, our financial accounts, summarizing into a monthly or quarterly report, doing year-end audits, and then repeating that process. Couple words about cost sharing and matching. So sometimes you have to do a cost share. You get money from somebody and they say you have to put something towards that project. So the cost share is the portion of the project that you are putting towards it. Sometimes it has to be in cash. Sometimes that cash has to be non-federal. It again depends on who the funder is. Sometimes it can be federal to federal. It just depends on the type of situation. And sometimes in kind is allowed. So sometimes you may not have to put up cash dollars, but you do have to put your own time into it. There can be voluntary or mandatory cost matches. So sometimes an organization requires you to do it, and sometimes you might do it just because you have some money to put in there and you're trying to buy down the cost of the overall project so you don't have to loan as much money or something like that. So that can be voluntary or mandatory. When you're doing it, usually this is both voluntary or mandatory, but definitely in the case of mandatory, you must document it, and you must document it with as much rigor as your other costs. So you can't just sort of ignore this part. You really need to make sure that you're doing a good job of documenting the costs with that match. And the paperwork supporting the in-kind match, if you do it that way, must be kept. Progress reporting, oftentimes you have to do progress reports. If you get any kind of EPA project, you have to do progress reporting. State agencies typically require it as well. So no matter who you're getting your money from, probably they will want some kind of progress report. Might be monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, or annually. But you need to make sure that you know ahead of time what the requirements are. And make sure that you know when they're due. Oftentimes it's 30 days following the end of the reporting period. So if it's quarterly, they're going to say, make sure you give us a report, 30 days at the end of the quarter and that sort of thing, and establish a means of alerting you that the report is due. You want to find an easy way to complete the report so you don't have to go back in time. You might have a place to write down significant events and that sort of thing. Anything you can do to try to make it easier to fill out your progress report so it's not such a big burden. Whenever you get grants are a little bit different from loans because you don't have to pay them back, but you want to make sure that you comply with all the internal regulation policies and procedures for the grant that you get, and make sure that you're Thinking about future audits for every transaction you do so that you're, again, have the right paperwork, have done it the right way. You want to make sure you're reviewing expenditures and budgets on each of the transactions, again, to make sure you're spending the grant wisely. And you don't want to supplant other costs. So basically, this means that you're not going to take something you currently use your own money for and take this grant money and start using that instead. The grant money is supposed to be for some specific purpose, so you can't use it to, change out other things. Make sure you know how to become aware of the requirements of your grant and that you are complying with them. Make sure you keep and document everything. Make sure it's stored in a place that it won't be lost. So if it's all paper records, make sure that they're more than one place because you could have a fire or a flood. A lot of times people put storage things in the basement and that's where it floods. We've had a lot of people that have lost records in fires. So make sure you don't have just one set of records. If you have electronic, make sure it's in the cloud or it's saved on multiple computers or it's, on jump drives that you put somewhere safe, that type of thing. And there are regulations that govern like how projects, grants, loans are managed, how payments are made, all this sort of thing. Make sure you know all of that before the project starts so that you don't make any mistakes. And every grant and loan has specific reporting requirements. And as we said at the very beginning, we wouldn't be able to go through every state and every type of place you can go get funding because, we've been talking about SRF, but there are other places you can go to get money. And every state will have different requirements and different rules. We can't say every single thing that you have to do, but just know that each one has that and that you should be aware of what those requirements are and make sure you follow them. So with that, I will open it up to any questions, and then I'm just going to move to our contact information, because if anything comes up after this webinar, or like Dawn said, if you want to make any comments about the webinar series in general and how you liked or didn't like or what you would like different, we're happy to do that. And the question
Heather.
box
So
is
it
where
looks like we don't. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying the question answer box is where you would put your question if you have one.
Yes, thank you. And it looks like we don't have any questions yet, but we still have a couple more minutes, so we'll give everyone a little bit of time if they would like to get their questions in right now.
And while we're doing that, I'll just thank everybody who did participate in this webinar and any other webinar that we had in the CWSRF series. And we really thank you for your attention and your commitment to coming back every month and listening to the topics that were of interest to you. And all of these will be recorded or are recorded and available. So if you missed one and you want to pick up that topic, you're welcome to go back and listen to those recordings.
All right, we have one question that just came in. When there is a match required, is it possible to secure a grant to cover any matching funds that aren't covered by worker labor?
And I would say it kind of depends. Usually, if there's a match required, sometimes they say they specifically want the system to cover that. So they want the system to put what they call skin in the game, where you have to put some of your own money towards it. But sometimes they just want the money to come from somewhere else, and then you might be able to get a grant from somewhere else to cover it. So it kind of depends on which agency you're working with, whether what their specific requirements of the match are. But oftentimes they're looking for you to put a little bit of your own self into it. So maybe they might require a 5% match or 10% match just to say, and these are typically not so much the Clean Water SRF, but maybe other grants that you might get at the state level. So it's possible that you might be able to secure a grant, but oftentimes they're looking to see if you can put some of your own money towards it so that you have a little bit of skin in the game. If they're giving you, like, say, a bunch of grant money, they want to just make sure that you have something invested in the project as well.
And this person responded, Rose said, okay, for small entities like mine, we are limited with our own funding. I've got plenty of skin in this game, haha.
And that is probably true. And again, I would certainly see what's available and, try to find other places. I think, some states are trying to help out with matches. So definitely, look around and see what resources exist for finding additional funding opportunities while the project is in construction. So that sounds like somebody's saying they're already in construction, but you might need additional monies for it. Oftentimes the original funder will agree to pay more if the project goes over budget. And if it's already covered in one loan, you're probably not going to get another one to cover that same thing. But if you're doing a project, say that you start on a project and you're expanding your sewer system and you only were doing 5 streets and you wanted to do 2 more, and that wasn't covered in the initial project, you could potentially reach out to another funding agency and say, hey, it's been going really well. We want to add 2 more streets. And if they're covering something different, that could be possible. If they're covering the same project, probably not, because you're not going to get 2 funders to pay for the same thing. But if you do have a cost overrun, I would definitely talk to whoever your funding agency is, because it's highly likely that they'll have a way to cover those additional costs, because they don't want to have a project stopped or not get to completion. So I would reach out to them first and say, uh-oh, we're over budget by X amount, and here's why. What can we do about it? For any of the original covered, and then for anything extra, you can definitely go to other funding sources and see if they'll cover projects that weren't initially included in your project.
And Heather, if I could just add to that,
Yeah.
in that design phase, you want to make sure that you've got contingencies built into your budget, because when we're working underground and we're, we're going to find things we didn't know about, or hit rock, or things like that. So when you're in the design phase with your engineer, make sure that you've got contingencies built in to try to avoid that situation from arising. And that you have a plan for those contingencies if you don't end up needing them for the construction, the design that's planned. But that's very typical practice, but just make sure that you're talking to your engineer. If you've got rock, you've had situations in the past come up with, just any kind of thing that would throw a project off schedule and off budget. And that way they can plan for it. And I know we can't plan for everything, but contingencies are there for a reason.
And you can also reach out to us if you have a specific question about a specific project. Feel free to reach out to us after the webinar and pose more specific questions. We're happy to try to find the answer or to connect you with somebody who could answer your question. Looks like we're a couple of minutes over, so we probably need to wrap it up now. But again, just thank you so much for your participation today and for your participation in any of the other SRF webinars that we've had in this series. We really appreciate it, and look forward to having you in future webinars.
Yes, thank you all for being here today, and thank you, Don and Heather, for sharing your expertise with us. Following this webinar, each of you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording. We ask that you please complete the webinar evaluation following this webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session or any previous sessions. This helps us plan our future webinars, and we hope to make them on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.
And it seems the event did not end.